They called me at 6 in the morning when my hands were still shaking from the night before, from a beer I did not need and the kind of loneliness that clings to you like wet clothes. The voice on the other end was my sister's, clipped and small, the kind of sound people make when they are trying to hold something huge and terrible in with both hands. "Jake's been in an accident," she said like it was a weather report. She didn't say what kind of accident. I could hear my mother in the background repeating the word hospital like a prayer. I remember standing in my kitchen with the kettle screaming and feeling like someone had unplugged the world. For a second I pictured a fender bender, something the insurance would cover. Then she said, "There's a body," and the kettle's scream turned into a shriek inside my head that nothing could drown out. By the time I got to the hospital, my father had already started talking to the police in a way I had seen 100 times across family dinners and PTA meetings, the way he polished a story until it glowed. He kept one hand on my shoulder like a man who was trying to stabilize a lamp that was about to tip over. My brother Jake sat in a chair, blood on his shirt, and a cigarette in his mouth like he was waiting for pizza. He was 26, immaculate, the family's golden weight that made everyone else feel like loose change. His eyes were red but empty, like someone who had watched a movie he already knew the ending to. Later, a nurse told me the EMTs found him walking around the scene, cooperating, but his breath smelled like cheap whiskey and the way he told the story made my stomach turn colder than the hospital floor. "She came out of nowhere," he said. "I hit her. I didn't see anything. It was a blur." Not an apology, not a shudder. Just a flat recounting, as if he were explaining why his coffee was cold. The victim was a woman on a bicycle, a name the nurses said like a confession, Maria Ortega. She was 34, a kindergarten teacher, and later I would learn she had been crossing at a marked crosswalk with a signal. The CCTV from a neighbor's doorbell showed a flash of headlights and a body. My mother watched the footage once, twice, then dropped the phone like it had melted in her hands. In the emergency room hallway, I listened as my family invented futures for Maria. "She's probably okay," my father said, his voice thin as paper. My sister kept whispering that everything would be fine because we had money and influence, and because Jake was Jake and Jake never did anything really bad. The words rolled over me like slate. They sounded like promises that had never been meant for me. The first police officer to speak with us had the kind of politeness that hides a file drawer of suspicion. He asked Jake if he'd been drinking, asked about speed, about whether there had been an attempt to render aid. Jake's laugh when he answered those questions is burned into me. He laughed at the idea of responsibility the way some people laugh at old jokes. "I didn't see her," he said again, not even looking at my parents, as if the sentence absolved him. Later, a forensics tech would tell me there were skid marks and a 30-foot scuff on the pavement, meaning someone had time to react but didn't. "Consciousness matters," she told me gently, as if explaining a broken watch. The word conscious kept rotating in my head. The image of Jake's face, blank and bored, slid across it like film. Back home, the house turned into a war room overnight. Lawyers with breath that smelled like legal pads came and went, their faces the color of old paper. My mother, always the diplomat at church bake sales, changed into someone who could call in favors and make small disasters vanish. The neighbors who had once brought casseroles were suddenly delivering silence and the kind of eyes that say don't ask. It was in those first panicked meetings that the tone changed from grief to calculation. Between phone calls, my father muttered about handling this, about keeping Jake's name out of headlines. My sister rehearsed statements like someone picking her outfit for a funeral and a parade at the same time. The thing that left me rooted to the carpet was how quickly the narrative they were building left out Maria, and how everything they said circled not around the woman who might be dead, but around preserving a future for one son while the rest of us became collateral. I watched them looking at me as if they were measuring how much ground they'd need to take, how much of me they could carve away and throw into the sea without drowning. They kept saying family comes first like it was a scripture. My chest hurt because I wanted to believe them the way I wanted to believe in God sometimes, purely out of habit. But in the quiet corners, when the lawyers left and the house smelled only of stale coffee and fear, I heard a different kind of whisper. My brother, the golden boy, made a joke about being careful on the road, and his grin was the kind that belonged in a different life, a life where consequences were a rumor. I remember thinking that if this is the worst consequence he ever faces, then the world is upside down. I remember also, with a clarity that is almost cruel, the little text I received from an unknown number that night: "Be ready to do what's best for the family. Call me when you can." It sat on my phone like a coal. I had no idea then that the coal would become an inferno that they'd try to throw me into. They sat me down in the den like it was a family meeting and not a tribunal. The blinds were pulled, the late afternoon light turned the room into a theater. My father parked himself in the big leather chair like a man used to being king. My mother occupied the love seat as if she had rehearsed worry 100 times. My sister perched on the armrest with her phone open like a cudgel. And Jake lounged against the wall, indifferent and smirking as if we were all waiting for the punchline. The lawyer was there too, dressed in the same navy suit I'd seen on our Christmas card photos. And his hands were calm when he unfolded a single sheet of paper that looked less like counsel and more like a blueprint. My father began as if he were explaining how to build a fence. "We need a plan," he said, simple and decisive. "We cannot let this blow up, not for Jake." The way he said Jake's name made it sound like an investment they couldn't lose. My mother talked about headlines the way she once talked about roast turkey, practical, terrified, already thinking of damage control. The lawyer spread photographs across the coffee table. A cracked headlight from a car that looked suspiciously like our old Civic, a blurry frame from a doorbell camera showing a dark hatchback, and a picture of Maria on her bicycle smiling at some daisies. None of that mattered to them the way the money did. Then my sister spoke in the voice she used on holiday calls to relatives we did not like. "You have a clean record," she said to me directly, like that was proof that I owed them. "You don't have kids, you're not married, your job is replaceable. You can take a sentence and bounce back, Jake can't." There was a moment there where her eyes were wet and precise. I felt something inside me tighten because the sentence wasn't a suggestion. It was an evaluation of my worth to the family ledger. "We can make this look clean," she added. "We can make you the driver. We can make it so the DA sees the file and says it's straightforward." My chest pounded and my hands went cold. "You want me to what?" My voice sounded small, like it wasn't mine. I wasn't joking. I had imagined 100 scenarios where family would rally around and take the blow together. I had never, in the ugliest daydreams, imagined my family drawing up a map to burn me alive. "Exactly that," the lawyer said, leaning forward, calm and efficient. He explained the mechanics in a way that should have made me feel reassured, but instead each sentence was a nail. "First, we create proximity. We have access to the estate car, but we stage some knocked-off trim on the Civic you were borrowing last month. We get our guy at the auto shop to do a quick repair that mimics the damage Maria's car suffered. We make sure paint transfer matches your vehicle's color. Second, we plant items. A glove with your DNA, a receipt for a liquor store purchased by you on the morning of the incident. Third, we work the witnesses. There are neighbors who will say they saw a car matching yours. We compensate them. They sign statements. Fourth, we have the call logs aligned. Our IT person can arrange for a GPS ping or manipulate timestamp records. The narrative is simple. You were speeding, intoxicated, hit a cyclist, and fled. We offer a confession as a mercy. A plea deal cuts exposure and headlines. It keeps Jake's name clean. They spoke like engineers building a bridge, not like people who had just watched someone they loved possibly crush another human being. I watched my mother listening, her face measured, the soft lines around her mouth gone hard. She reached across and touched my arm, the touch cold and precise. "We will make this easy for you," she said. "We will take care of you, we will visit, we will make sure your job is safe when you get out, we will pay for appeals if that happens." The list of promises was long, and each one was a chain. They did not leave out the punishment side, the veiled threats tucked into each sentence like razor blades. "If you don't," my father said quietly, and it was the smartest, most dangerous thing he had said yet, "then we'll have to consider alternatives. Publicity is a vicious animal, reports will dig. There are things in your past that can be handled, you know that." The lawyer folded his hands and added, "You must understand the optics. We can either present a clean narrative now or risk a prolonged investigation that will expose the family to civil suits, to the press, to ruin. From a pragmatic standpoint, you taking responsibility reduces everyone else's risk." I felt betrayed in a way that cut deeper than anger. The only word for the way they kept circling the idea that I was expendable was cold. They were calculating sacrifice. Jake sat back and smiled like someone watching a prize go up for auction. He said casually, "Do what's right for mom, man, you know she'll need you." It was the worst kind of moral laundering, reduce murder to family maintenance. They explained logistics with chilling detail. My phone would accidentally have messages to and from a number set up for the purpose of staging panic. A blood sample would be misattributed because the lab tech was on our payroll. The neighbor's ring footage would be cropped and time-stamped differently. They'd use a sympathetic prosecutor we owed favors to get a lenient plea arrangement, or at least to keep the case out of the tabloids while I served a quiet sentence. The plan was so airtight in their heads that I could almost see the box they'd already labeled with my name. They called it sacrifice, they called it family, they promised they would make sure I came out okay. They made it sound noble and inevitable. When they were done, I sat there with the photographs on the table and the air humming around me like a bad radio. I had never felt smaller in my life. My heart pounded and my throat felt raw with something like grief and something like fury. There was a silence after my father's last words. Jake shrugged like it was simply done. "Think about it," my sister said, reaching for my hand in a way that was both pleading and possessive. The lawyer left me a card with his number and the written outline of the plan. My parents kissed me on the forehead with the same gestures they'd used to calm me after childhood nightmares. "We're asking you to do this for all of us," my mother whispered. "For the family." I was supposed to answer right then. They wanted a decision like a signed check. I nodded because my body moved on its own to comply, because I was stunned and afraid and alone in a room that should have felt like home. But inside a voice I barely recognized started to say no. I learned quickly that acting broken is a performance anyone in my family could direct, so I decided to be the best actor in the room. I slept on the couch with a blanket that smelled like my mother's perfume because it made the tears look real, and I practiced a voice that could wobble at just the right moment. I let the sobs come when they wanted them, let my knees go weak in front of the lawyer so he could set the timetable. I let my father see me staring into nothing, so he could feel the moral weight of his decision bending me. I let my sister hold me and whisper that I was doing something noble. Each embrace they offered felt like a leash being tightened, but on the outside I looked like the family sacrifice they wanted. They gave me lines and I memorized them as if my life depended on it, because to buy time I had to be convincing. I suggested a public statement, slow and contrite, and even agreed to have my fingerprints on a glove if it helped them breathe easier. I agreed to meet the DA informally and to cooperate with statements that would make me look guilty. I let them think they were breaking me down because I wanted them to lower their guard, to speak freely in front of me and to reveal the seams of their plan. While I cried, I listened. While I apologized, I counted names and dates and phrases. Their arrogance was loud and it was useful. In the smallest hours, I started to make notes nobody would notice. When they slept, I opened my laptop and typed what I heard into a document labeled grocery list so it would not attract attention if someone skimmed my files. I learned who the mechanic was that could do a quick paint fix, the neighbor with the doorbell camera who had been promised money, the lab tech who was on our side. I wrote down every promise, every name, every offhand threat. I photographed the laid-out maps and mock-ups on the coffee table with my phone while pretending to go to the bathroom. I recorded a few tiny clips when the family conversations grew loud and careless. Each clip felt like a stolen heartbeat, and I saved them to a cloud account with a name my mother would never think to check. My performance had to be total. The fake despair, the slurred speech at brunch, the public face of a man who had finally broken and admitted guilt. I went to a small vigil the church organized and let people come up to me and offer pity. I posted a meek, sorrowful message on my social media because appearances mattered for the story they wanted the world to believe. People commented things like "take responsibility and pray for you," and in that noise my family found cover. Jake watched all of this like a director pleased with the opening scene, sometimes giving me a small nod as if to say well done. It felt like rubbing salt into a wound to receive my brother's approval for becoming their scapegoat, and yet I kept the act alive because I knew the next move required them to trust me. Underneath the act, my mind was an engine. I called an old friend who used to do work for a small firm and asked him how to make sure recordings were time-stamped and backed up. I asked questions that sounded like they came from a man confused by grief. How do you save a voicemail? Can footage be downloaded? Who can I talk to about phone metadata? Each question looked like someone trying to understand his own unraveling, but the answers were steps in a trap I was building. I started to follow small threads, like where my sister had said the money would come from and the bank account names my father casually mentioned. I quietly copied emails when I had the chance and kept screenshots of conversations that looked nothing like the story they told publicly. What I most wanted was time, and pretending to be defeated bought me exactly that. They relaxed because I seemed to be falling apart, and in their relaxation I saw cracks I could use. They left documents on the coffee table, tossed their phones on end tables, and spoke plainly to each other in my presence because they believed I was already halfway in prison. I went along with their plan until I could see the entire architecture of it, until I knew the players and their vulnerabilities. I pretended to accept the role of sacrificial lamb because it put me in a position to collect the proof I would need to turn the whole house of cards into rubble. And so I smiled through the pain, I let them believe the script was working, and I counted the hours until I could stop pretending and start hitting back. I turned my pretend defeat into cover for everything I planned to do. If they thought I was collapsing, they left doors open. They stopped checking my pockets and assumed my phone was a diary of contrition. That gave me a corridor of opportunity to move through their world without provoking suspicion. I started small and then risked bigger things, letting fear sharpen every careful step. I bought a cheap voice recorder that clipped inside my watch band and another tiny device that fit under the couch cushion. I palmed them like talismans and wore them to family dinners, to the lawyers' rooms, to car rides where they spoke like conspirators instead of parents. I let them brag. I let them plan. I let them drop names into my lap like breadcrumbs. My old friend Marcus, who used to work in IT and still knew people who knew people, became my secret partner. I did not ask for illegal miracles, I asked for plausible, plain help. He taught me how to mirror my phone to a private encrypted account before I handed it over for supposed checks, and he explained how phone backups sometimes keep ghosts the world thinks are gone. With a lot of patience and a few $100s, a data recovery lab pulled messages from clouds my family believed had been scrubbed. I read the text that my sister thought she had deleted while she watched me on TV for sympathy. There were receipts for cash payments, a chain of short emails between my father and the mechanic about quick work and make sure the paint matches, and a terse note from the lab tech promising discretion for samples. Each file felt like a stone I could throw through the house windows. I was terrified every time I walked into places I had no business being. I walked into the mechanic's shop like a man who wanted to get his brakes checked, while inside I was looking for someone who could confirm the parts they'd ordered were inconsistent with the model they claimed. I whispered to a woman behind the counter who had been promised nothing and whose conscience was thicker than her fear. She told me about late-night calls, about a box with a headlight they said was evidence but never came with a police report. She said she was paid, and then hush money stopped and guilt started to leak. Her eyes trembled when she gave me a written note that put dates and names together in a warm, human scrawl. The neighbor with the doorbell camera was the key I had not expected to fit the lock. He had been promised money to crop and hand over footage, and he believed it had been done. He was drunk on their assurances and sloppy enough to say as much in my presence. I did not trust his edited clip. I coaxed him into letting me see the original files under the pretense of collecting the truth for my own closure. He left his door unlocked one afternoon and I copied everything onto a thumb drive while his dog begged for attention at my feet. The footage showed not just the flash of headlights, but the slow reveal of a bumper sticker, a half plate, an old dent on the passenger fender, details my family had told the police matched my car. But on the raw file, the timestamps were messy and the car was not mine. I watched it in my car in the parking lot and felt the first real surge of hope I had felt since Maria's name. I also found a witness my family had dismissed as unreliable, the kind of person people assume no one would listen to. Maria's coworker, a young teacher named Rosa, remembered the crossing differently. She had not been at the scene when the crash happened but had met Maria earlier that morning at the school staff room. Maria mentioned a dent she had not caused and a car that had nearly buzzed her the day before. Rosa had saved a social media post Maria made about a neighbor's old blue hatchback that liked to speed. Somehow my family had not thought to check Maria's phone or social feeds. They were busy building a story. They had forgotten to look at the truth Maria left scattered in small places. The most dangerous piece of my puzzle was the lab tech who had agreed to misattribute a sample. I had to meet her alone and sound like a man asking for fairness, not a guilty son. When I found her, she was tired and living in a cheaper apartment than her degree deserved. She had been promised work and then pressure, and she confessed what she had been asked to do in a voice that trembled with shame. I recorded her on my watch, capturing a quiet, guilty admission that my family had not only planned to plant evidence, but had started moving it through hands trained to be silent. Getting that recording put me on a knife edge. I left her apartment with my hands shaking, knowing that if anyone found out she had spoken to me, she might vanish into the kind of sudden silence they used to bury little problems. There were near misses. Once Jake caught me leaving the house with a bag he thought was mine and asked where I was going. I told him I was going to talk to a priest because the guilt was eating me. He leaned in and said plainly that if I stepped out of line there were other things he could make appear from the past. His smile was a thin blade. I came back inside and pretended to collapse on the couch, letting my body sell the story the way a con actor sells a lie. He left satisfied, and I exhaled like someone who had narrowly passed through a storm. I cataloged everything into 3 piles. What proved what had happened that night, what proved my family's orchestration, and what tied people who had been promised silence to their payments and favors. I saved copies in 3 different clouds under childish names, gave a friend who lived out of state a physical drive, and left an envelope with a lawyer I could trust who owed me nothing but the truth. Every time I slipped a file into a safe place, I felt like I was stitching a rope I could climb out on. I also felt the cold weight of the game I was playing. I was no hero yet. I was a man who had learned to lie well enough to save himself, and I had become, in the small private hours, someone my family would never imagine until it was too late. I agreed to the meeting because it was the only way they'd let me close the loop on their little theater of guilt. They wanted a signature, a taped confession, my name on a paper that would let them file the headlines and sleep easier. I told them yes with my chin in my chest and my voice ragged because the best lies are built on tiny truths. What they did not know was that by saying yes I had already set a clock. I had already put shards of their plan into hands they would never control. I picked the lawyer's office because it was neutral for them and familiar enough to sound safe. Jake liked that detail. It made him smirk and relax as if a courtroom glare would never reach him. The morning of the meeting, I showed up with a manila folder of what looked like a draft confession and a list of dates. I kept my face pleading and small. My phone was a useless, sorrow-filled thing to them, the public record of a man breaking down. Hidden under my watch band was the recorder I had bought on a whim from a pawn shop. In my coat pocket was a thumb drive labeled Confession. The thumb drive had a twin already uploaded to 3 different places: a cloud account I controlled, the inbox of an investigative reporter I had trusted, and a secure folder at the DA's office. Outside the building, an unmarked car sat, 2 detectives inside, their badges tucked under sport coats and their hands on their coffee cups like men keeping warm. I sat down at the table and let them circle. My father put a hand on the folder as if territory could be reclaimed by touch. The lawyer pretended to go through formalities while the family rehearsed their lines and the way they wanted me to end my life in paperwork. I could smell the expensive coffee and the grease of their certainty. The lawyer read the draft and nodded like a craftsman admiring his handiwork, the way a man admires a lock he made sure cannot be picked. My sister's hand brushed mine, that practiced hold full of sorrow and command. All of it was meant to push me toward the signature that would make them safe. When the lawyer reached for the paper, I pushed the thumb drive onto the table and said quietly, "Before I sign, there are a few things you should hear." My voice was small and steady, and for a moment their faces slid from triumph to confusion. I had rehearsed the next 50 seconds for months in my head until my pulse remembered the rhythm. I hit play on my phone. The room filled with their voices. Not a speech, not a confession, but the kind of banter that proves intent. There was my father's calm counting off payments to a mechanic. There was my sister's voice, crisp and clinical, outlining what items to plant. There was Jake laughing about how we'll make sure he takes it, and the lawyer explaining how to handle a lab tech. The recordings were rough and domestic, the kind of evidence you find in bathrooms and kitchens and car rides home, ordinary places where terrible plans lose their armor. You could hear chairs scrape and laughter when they thought the camera was off, and you could hear them believe they had hidden everything behind the ritual of family. I watched the color leave their faces. The lawyer's fingers tightened on the paper like a man who suddenly realized his script had become the exhibit. My sister tried to snatch the phone and said, panicked, that the audio was edited. I had expected that. I had expected everything. As she lunged, I pushed another file to the speaker. The mechanic's receipts time-stamped, emails between the lab tech and my father with phrases like discretion arranged. The neighbor's doorbell footage unedited showing the car that hit Maria with a bumper detail that matched the mechanic's bill, not my old Civic. I slid photos across the table. Bank transfers with memos, the lab tech's trembling apology recorded in my watch, a note in the mechanic's handwriting that named dates and times. At my signal, the detectives who had been listening in a room down the hall walked calmly into the office. They were not angry with me. They had been waiting for the moment when they could act without giving my family time to burn the evidence. They had warrants, they had statements. The DA I had reached a week earlier stood behind them, expression flat and sure, no theatrics, no dramatic shouting. Just the slow, methodical professionalism of people who had been handed a road map to a crime that was bigger than one night. My father tried to bluff his way through it, his voice rising. He reached for the phone with shaking hands and said something about how I had set them up. He claimed entrapment that I had fabricated. I played the recording of him earlier that morning, advising careful placement of a glove and timing of a liquor receipt, the words clear and uncoerced. My sister accused me of betrayal. My mother started to cry and talk about sacrifice as if those tears could reverse bank transfers. Jake stood up trying to pull the folder to his chest, but the detective's hand went to his shoulder like a promise and then the cuffs clicked. For one long, absurd second, Jake looked at me like he had been cut out from a photograph and placed somewhere unfamiliar. They all became smaller in those moments. The lawyer's face morphed from competence to collapse when a detective read the charges aloud: conspiracy to obstruct justice, evidence tampering, filing false statements, criminal negligence that led to death. The DA announced that they had been preparing an indictment and that the recordings and documents I had sent sealed the narrative too tightly for slippage. I felt something odd in my chest, like a pressure that had been holding a storm in releasing. But even as they were led away, I thought of Maria. I had not done this for revenge. I had done it so that her name would not be swallowed by a lie. The press were already there because the reporter I had trusted had started a live story the minute the building's doors opened, and the world got to hear their voices, unprotected by family reputation. Within hours, their donors withdrew. The foundation my father had chaired paused operations. The house that had been a fortress for them suddenly had people knocking at its gates. The arrests were not melodramatic, but they were irrevocable. The assets were frozen, the favors evaporated like smoke. When it was over, the office felt like an empty theater. I walked out into cold air and it hit me with a force that had nothing to do with justice. It had been righteous and necessary, but it was also final in a way I could not step back from. My sister's screams echoed in the distance, a sound I will never forget the shape of. People celebrate the moment the villain gets caught, but they do not often talk about the strange, quiet space afterwards, where the person who pulled the string is left to count the cost. I went to a small memorial for Maria later that week and listened to people who had loved her speak about bright classrooms and small hands held on the playground. I don't know if my exposing of my family truly honors her. What I know is that the truth came out of ordinary rooms, from conversations too honest for their own protection. I had wanted to protect my brother and been offered a bargain that would cost another human life and my own future. I refused that bargain by building a worse one for them, and in doing so I turned a family that taught me loyalty into a legal case. I am not proud in the way winners boast. I am hollowed and furious and oddly calm. The trap worked because I let them think I was the easy answer. Now they are in custody and the machine of law is moving. What they tried to bury is airing on every screen, and the people I once loved are being dismantled piece by evidence they themselves handed me. The last twist is the one I let happen quietly. Before they were taken, I had sent everything to a lawyer in another state and to a woman at a newspaper who promised me only one thing, that Maria would be more than an afterthought. That, in the aftermath, felt like the only moral victory left. They wanted me to sign the paper like a sacrament and then mop up the mess with lawyers and sympathetic statements. But when they started laying out the exact lies they wanted me to tell, I could feel the room folding into the shape I'd been waiting for. My sister read the script with a practiced voice. The lawyer coached me on cadence and remorse as if I were reading a eulogy. My father looked at me like a man waiting for his son to become a ghost to protect a fortune. And Jake smirked the way he always did when he thought a machine he had helped build would carry him away untouched. I let them speak until the last line, until their plan was carved into the air like a name on a tombstone. Because the more detailed they were, the easier it would be to bury them in their own words. When they finished, I pushed the thumb drive across the table the way a surgeon slides a scalpel into the light. I said, quiet at first, I have something to add, and then I hit play. Their voices came back at them, ordinary and sharp, unplanned admissions of payments of planted items of edited footage. You could hear someone laugh and then promise money and then say, we will make sure he signs. It was not cinematic, it was not grand. It was ugly and domestic, and therefore more damning than any perfectly staged confession ever could be. The lawyer's face went gray as if someone had drained the color out of it. My father looked like he'd been slapped. Jake's smirk dropped into a small, animal look of surprise. A detective who had been listening a room away walked in steady, like a man who had been given a map and finally found the place it pointed. He placed a copy of the warrant on the table without flourish and then read the charges. Conspiracy to obstruct justice, tampering with evidence, accessory to vehicular manslaughter, and a raft of fraud charges connected to the payments. The DA I had called days earlier stood behind him with files in hand and a small, professional smile that belonged to people who only showed up when they were certain. My family started to talk at once, a flurry of denials and accusations, but the recordings had already done their work. They had spoken in the way people do who believe themselves safe, and safety is a terrible thing to lose. My sister lunged for my phone and accused me of fabricating the audio, of doctoring the files. I had expected that, and I pushed a second piece of evidence across the desk. An email thread between my father and the mechanic with times and parts listed, time-stamped and archived by the server. A bank transfer that matched the amounts they had discussed to the neighbor who was supposed to edit the footage. My watch recorded the lab tech apologizing that a sample would be misattributed for everyone's protection. The neighbor's raw doorbell footage played on the office monitor and showed the shape of a hatchback that did not match my old Civic, a sticker on the bumper visible for 2 frames. Each artifact slotted into place like teeth in a lock. You could watch the story implode. They tried to bargain and then they tried to lie. My father tried to appeal to history and to sentiment, to the nights of sacrifices and the vacations and the vows that he claimed justified what they had been ready to do. It was grotesque watching him try to paper over the ledger with memories. Jake tried to play ignorance, said he could not remember the impact, that his drinking messed with his head, but the forensics report which the detectives produced from their kit had already contradicted him. There were skid marks and a speed estimate, and a concentration of guilt that pointed squarely at someone who had tried to escape responsibility. When the detectives cuffed them, the room did not erupt in Hollywood clangor. There were no dramatic screams in close-up, no sudden confessions. There was just the sound of handcuffs closing, the rustle of papers, the small, strange noise of a life being clipped away. Jake looked at me as they led him out. There was a look on his face I did not recognize, not arrogance and not fear, but something like the realization of a man who had believed he was untouchable until his body rubbed against the world as it actually was. Outside, press lights started to blink like a strange sunrise. The reporter I had sent copies to was already posting, and the city's usual chatter swelled into a howl. The DA announced they would seek indictment and that the investigation into Maria's death would continue without interference. The family assets were frozen by order of a judge who had been given the documentation I had forwarded the night before, which meant whatever hedge the family thought would protect them from civil suits vanished almost immediately. I had not done what I did for headlines or for revenge. I had done it because someone had died, and because the people who were supposed to protect the family had chosen to protect a person instead. After they were taken, I sat in the lobby and watched strangers shift their weight and look at me in a dozen different ways. Some of them had pity in their faces, some disdain, and some a small, sharp gratitude I could not yet accept without tasting the metal of it. Maria's sister came up to me and put a hand on my arm. She did not forgive me for anything, she did not need to. She said only, "Thank you for not letting her be erased." Her eyes were small wet stones, and she was steadier than anyone else in that building. The gavel fell in a courtroom weeks later, not in that moment but in the slow machinery of indictments and preliminary hearings. My family pleaded not guilty at first, and then, faced with the paperwork and the witnesses and a stack of undeniable proof, some of them changed their tune. The judge sentenced where he could, and where he could not yet decide there were trials pending. I testified. I told the truth in a voice that shook and sometimes broke, and when it was my turn to meet Maria's mother in the witness room, I felt a guilt so big it could have swallowed a town. She looked at me and nodded in a way that did not absolve, but accepted that I had done what I could. What I feel now is not victory. There is no victory in watching people you once loved go through cuffs and arraignment. There is only a hollow correctness, a rightness that cost more than my family will ever know. The law did what laws can do when they are fed the right proof. Justice, imperfect and slow, began to move. The gavel has fallen on part of the story, and now the rest of it will be played out in courtrooms and depositions and bad newspaper columns. I live with the knowledge that human lives are fragile and that loyalty can be twisted into something monstrous. I did the only thing I could think of. I stopped a lie from becoming the story everyone would remember, and for that alone I carry both relief and an ache that will not quit. When everything started to crack, it did so like frozen glass, a single tap and then 1,000 jagged edges. The detectives had stepped out for paperwork, and one of them had left the office door cracked open. No one planned for my sister to reach into her phone and pull up a bank app in a panic, but she did, fingers trembling, and the screen lit up with names and transfers like a confession in light. My father lunged for the phone, and the two of them began to shout at once, voices crossing into the awful music of people who had spent their lives smoothing edges now tripping over the same rope. Jake slammed his fists on the table and shouted that he had never wanted any of this, that they had pushed him to drink, and then with a sudden, awful sheepishness, he tried to point the blame at my father for ordering the cover-up. It was immediate, ugly, and public. They began to peel away layers from each other the way people peel rotten fruit. My mother, who had spoken the guilt salvation line about family, suddenly offered a sharp-eyed list of who knew what and when. She insisted she had tried to stop the mechanics and the lab tech, that she had only agreed after being threatened with exposure about a private donation that would ruin her reputation. My sister shot back that she had paid the neighbor because the neighbor had sworn he would never talk if he was compensated, that her father had promised to replace the money through the foundation accounts. My father, who had always been the calm center of the household, turned into a man who flung his history at them, claims about old favors that had to be repaid, and a trembling argument that he had been protecting a legacy. It was theatrical in a way that made my stomach turn. A detective who had been monitoring the meeting walked back in as the voices rose and sat down with a soft, professional authority. He asked them to calm down, to speak one at a time, and then, with the sort of coolness that only comes from seeing too many confessions unspool, he asked who had initiated the payments. The question landed like a bell. My sister was the first to point at the papers the DA's team had brought to the table, and then, in a sudden, panicked reversal, she accused my father of instructing her to move the money through a shell account. My father leaned forward and accused my sister of forging his signature on fund transfers. Every denial was undercut by timestamps and server logs the detectives had printed and laid out, like a picnic for truth. In the course of 15 minutes, they downgraded their family history to a crime scene map of motives. My brother's face cracked with something like desperation as he tried to point to anything that would keep him out of a cell. He named donors and named dates and hinted at favors my father had called in, only to have the detectives read back emails that showed he had also texted the neighbor to take care of it so it doesn't touch the family. The neighbor who had been paid to edit footage had been brought in because he had finally woken up to the shape of what he had done, and he stood in the doorway, eyes darting between us, and said under oath that money had come from an account titled the Kessler Fund, which had been drained in a sequence of transfers my father had signed off on. The sound of my family accusing each other filled the room like rain. They turned on the lawyer too. The man who had crafted their plan tried at first to maintain his professional distance, but when the detectives started to read phone records that showed him texting my sister about keeping things tight and then emailing a mechanic asking for discreet work, he stuttered and said he had only been advising. My sister's voice rose and she called him a coward and an accessory, and the room shifted into a courtroom with the stakes suddenly very real. The lawyer's face went white and he asked for a lawyer himself. The detectives handed him a card and informed him they would be speaking to him as a witness. He left clutching his briefcase like a man who had lost the script he thought he was following. My emotions during the scramble were a ruined weave of satisfaction and sorrow. Watching people I had loved and depended on throw each other under the bus felt like finally seeing the truth of them stripped bare. But each accusation that landed revealed more about how far they were willing to go. My mother accused my sister of using family funds to pay off the neighbor because she feared exposure of a tax irregularity. My sister accused my mother of hiding money because she had been afraid my father would lose their donations. My father, in a strangled voice, said he had been trying to keep the family's name clean and that his fear had turned into cowardice. Law enforcement took notes and recorded these recriminations as if they were collecting crooked jigsaw pieces. The detectives kept circling back to evidence. A written check cleared from the family account, the mechanic's signed note, the lab tech's recorded confession that someone had pressured her and offered payment to misattribute a sample. Each new accusation was met with a calm, methodical follow-up and a document pulled from a stack. When my father finally tried to accuse me of planting evidence, one detective produced a chain of custody log they'd compiled from the files I'd sent days earlier. They put my recordings on the room's speaker and the voices played again, unadorned and humiliating. My father's face crumpled as he realized that the narrative he'd tried to build could not be unstitched by a single angry denial. Jake tried a last frantic move and attempted to call names of people he thought might take a fall for him, but the detectives interrupted him with a warning about obstruction. An officer calmly warned that making false statements would only add charges. He stopped mid-sentence, his bravado gone. The room that had once been a table of strategists became, in short order, a collection of people who had no script but 1,000 reasons to survive. When it was finally quiet enough for the detectives to speak again, they read the possible charges and told my family what their options were. That silence was worse than shouting. It was full of the sound of lives collapsing into something they could not control. Outside, the press had started to circle, and the phones in the room vibrated with messages from acquaintances and donors asking whether the headlines were true. The foundation my father had run put out a muted statement and froze all accounts. Friends and colleagues called to distance themselves. The social scaffolding that had propped my family up for years fell away in that hour, piece by piece. I sat at the edge of the chaos and felt nothing heroic. I felt like a man who had set a rat trap and watched an entire room of rats fight over who had pushed the right buttons. It was ugly, necessary, and complete. The detectives completed their notes and arranged for formal statements. My family members were taken to interview rooms one by one, cuffs not yet on but the inevitability of them there. Each step in the process made them smaller, and each betrayal that flew across the table left me with the quiet knowledge that the worst part of their plan had been not the crime they tried to cover up, but the fact that they had once thought I would be expendable. I walked into the station like a man who had rehearsed nothing and everything. I had the folder, the thumb drives, the printed emails, bank records, timestamps, and a chain of custody log burned to a CD because the DA had asked for physical backups. I handed it all over to the detective who had been patient with my calls, and I watched him flip pages with the kind of concentration that makes paperwork feel like war planning. I had rehearsed my statement until my voice would not tremble, not because I was trying to sound brave, but because I owed Maria a clear, calm account of what had happened. I told the truth in the same order I had assembled the proof. The night, the sequence of calls, the payments, the lab conversation, the doorbell footage, the mechanic's notes, the neighbor's admission, my family's meeting where they spoke plainly about planting evidence. I spoke slow so there could be no confusion, and so the room would not be able to say later that I had been emotional and unreliable. When I finished, I felt an odd lightness, as if the sentence I had been carrying had been set down on a table at last. The DA's office moved like a professional emergency. They filed charges within days, and the arrest warrants were executed with an efficiency that felt almost surgical. My father was taken first, not in dramatic fashion but with a quiet dignity that made him smaller than any headline could. He was charged with conspiracy, wire fraud, embezzlement through the foundation accounts, and obstruction. The foundation he had chaired was immediately put under court-appointed oversight, audited, and frozen. Donations were rescinded, and board members resigned while the news cycle chewed through their press releases. My sister was indicted on charges of tampering with evidence, paying witnesses, and falsifying records. The lawyer who had helped them draft the plan was charged with bribery and accessory after evidence showed he arranged payments and called favors. Jake faced the most brutal indictment: vehicular manslaughter, driving under the influence, and obstruction of justice for his role in the attempted cover-up. The mechanic and the neighbor were also brought in. Their cooperation reduced their exposure, but it left them with records and guilty expressions I will never forget. There were civil suits too, as the family of Maria filed for wrongful death and for punitive damages. The city ran a separate investigation into the foundation's books and found years of misallocated funds and questionable donations that had been moved through shell accounts, the same accounts my family had used to pay the neighbor and cover the mechanic. Donors wanted answers, and the foundation's name was dragged through hearings and subpoenas. Within weeks, the family business partners severed ties, attorneys wrote stern letters, and the people who had once smiled at our backyard barbecues started backing away from our house like you back away from a bruise. It was not revenge for me. It was the law unspooling everything that had been done to protect a person who had in one night killed someone and who had afterward been protected by a family willing to swallow another life. Courtrooms became the new rooms I lived in. I gave my statement in a formal deposition where my words were under oath and recorded in a ledger. I testified at hearings where my voice shook and then steadied with the kind of clarity that comes when someone has spent nights lining up facts. The prosecutor used the emails I had forwarded and the recordings I had saved to build a timeline that left no space for denial. My testimony was not spectacle. It was the raw paperwork of truth assembled into sentences. The defense tried to shred credibility to claim entrapment that I had manufactured the files, but the backups I had sent to an out-of-state lawyer and a reporter months earlier provided independent timestamps and a public trail that could not be undone. The judge's face during one hearing was as blank and slow as a metronome. When he called for a cooling-off period, I felt the gears of justice turning in a way that was inexorable. When pleas started to happen, the difference between what I wanted and what the system delivered was clearer than I had expected. My father, facing federal exposure and the loss of everything he had run, took a plea on several counts, admitting to embezzlement and conspiracy. The sentencing terms were severe, years were inevitable, and the fines would shatter what remained of his public life. My sister fought longer, then took a deal that left her with a felony record and community service and removed her from any role in the foundation. Jake went to trial on the manslaughter charges and was convicted. He received a sentence that included prison time for the death he caused and for the obstruction he helped orchestrate. The lawyer was disbarred and pleaded guilty to bribery. The mechanic and the neighbor received reduced sentences in exchange for full cooperation and testimony that tied every payment back to the family accounts I had exposed. People ask now whether I felt vindicated. The answer is complicated. There was relief, a clean kind of relief that comes from not having a lie to hide behind anymore. There was also a hollow ache, the weight of watching my family be dismantled by paperwork and prosecutors. Justice arrived not as a roar but as a long series of hearings, motions, and rulings that stripped away influence and money. The foundation dissolved. The donors pressed for restitution for misused funds, and the city updated policies to prevent such corruption again. Maria's family received a civil settlement that never felt like enough, but that did provide funds for memorials and future support for a scholarship in her name. I donated a portion of what I received to that scholarship because stealing the family narrative had never been about money for me. It was about making sure one human life did not get erased by another's privilege. Freedom for me came in fits. I was free legally faster than I was free emotionally. People still whisper, acquaintances still take the long route around me at community events, and there were threats and ugly notes in the weeks after the indictments that reminded me that truth does not always make people gentle. but I can walk down a street without imagining I am being watched for mistakes to exploit. I am able to sit in a small apartment with the blinds open and work on a simple thing, a podcast where I tell stories of ordinary people who chose truth over comfort. It is a small project, nothing like the life I had been given, but it is honest work and that feels like a kind of restitution. I never wanted my family's destruction. I wanted accountability. There is a difference. The law gave me what it could: indictments, convictions, reforms, and a public airing of what had been done in the quiet of our living room. The cost was high. The people I loved most are paying for it, and that is a burden I carry every time I read the court transcripts or pass a newsstand with their photos. But somewhere in the center of the chaos is Maria's name, no longer a footnote or a smear in a tidy story. That, more than anything else, is why I did what I did. That, and the quiet hope that I have learned what loyalty must never ask of you.